So when we left off at chapter 15, the lion had raced all through Narnia, up hills and down hills and up mountains and across streams and faster than a horse. Remember that ride? Wouldn't that have been fun to be on there with them? That would have been one fun ride, I think. Fast, I'll tell you. And then he raced down. They saw the witch's castle. Remember that? He raced down and didn't even hesitate. He just jumped, almost flew over the wall and landed on the inside. And that's where we left them. So chapter 16, what happened about the statues? What an extraordinary place, cried Lucy. All these stone animals and people too. It's like a museum. Hush, said Susan. Aslan is doing something. And he was indeed. He had bounded up to the stone lion that was there. Remember that stone lion that Edmund at first thought was going to attack him? Then he realized it was stone when he reached out to touch it. That's the lion that Aslan is just going up to now. And he breathed on it. Then, without waiting a moment, he whisked around almost as if he'd been like a cat chasing its tail. And he breathed also on the stone dwarf, which the lion had been looking at, remember? He was standing a few feet from the lion with his back to it, and then the Aslan pounced on a tall stone dryad which stood beyond the dwarf, turned rapidly aside to deal with a stone rabbit on his right, and then rushed on to two centaurs. But at that moment, Lucy said, "Oh, Susan, look at the lion here." Now, I expect you've seen when someone has put a lighted match to a bit of newspaper that's propped up in a grate against an unlit fire, and for a second after the match is held there, nothing really seems to have happened. And then you notice a tiny streak of flame creeping along the edge of the newspaper. Well, it was like that now. For a second after Aslan had breathed upon him, the stone lion looked just the same. Then a tiny streak of gold began to run along his white marble back. Then it spread. Then the color seemed to lick all over him as the flame licks all over a bit of paper. Then, while his hindquarters were still obviously stone, the lion at the front of himself shook his mane, and all the heavy stone folds rippled into living hair. Then he opened a great red mouth, warm and living, and gave a great, prodigious, excited yawn. And now his hind legs had come to life. He lifted one of them and scratched himself. Then, having caught sight of Aslan, he went bounding over to him and frisking around him, whimpering with delight and jumping up to lick his face. Of course, the children's eyes turned to follow the lion, but the sight they saw was so wonderful that they soon forgot about just him. Everywhere the statues were coming to life. The courtyard looked no longer like a museum with just stone animals in it. It looked more like a zoo. Creatures were running after Aslan and dancing around him till, well, he was almost hidden in the crowd. Instead of all that deadly white stone, the courtyard was now a blaze of color, glossy chestnut sides of centaurs, indigo bluish horns of unicorns, dazzling plumage, that's the feathers of birds, reddy brown of foxes, dogs and satyrs, yellow stockings and crimson hoods of dwarfs, and the birch girls in silver, the beech girls in fresh, transparent green, and the larch girls in green that was so bright it was almost yellow. And instead of the deadly silence, the whole place rang with the sounds of happy roarings and brayings and yelpings and barkings, squealing, cooing, neighing, stamping, shouts, hurrahs, songs, and of course, lots of laughter. "Oh," said Susan in a different tone, "look, I wonder, is it safe?" Lucy looked and saw that Aslan had just breathed on the feet of the stone giant. "Ah, it's all right," shouted Aslan joyously. "Once the feet are put right, all the rest of him will follow." "Well, that wasn't exactly what I meant," whispered Susan to Lucy. But it was too late to do anything about it now, even if Aslan would have listened to her. The change was already creeping up the giant's legs. Now he was moving his feet. A moment later, he lifted the club off his shoulder, rubbed his eyes, and said, "Bless me, I must have been asleep. Now, where's that dratted little witch that was running about on the ground? Somewhere just by my feet it was." But when everyone had shouted up to him to explain what had really happened, and when the giant had put his hand to his ear and got them to repeat it all again, so that at last he understood, then he bowed down till his head was no further off the ground than the top of a haystack, and he touched his cap repeatedly to Aslan, beaming all over his honest, ugly face. Giants of any sort are now so rare in England or even anywhere in the world, and so few giants are good-tempered that 10 to 1 you have never seen a giant when his face is beaming. It is a sight well worth looking at. "Now, for the inside of this house," said Aslan. "Look alive, everyone, upstairs and downstairs. Up to my lady's chamber. Leave no corner unsearched. You'll never know where some poor prisoner may be concealed." And so into the interior they all rushed, and for several minutes the whole of that dark, horrible, fusty old castle echoed with the openings of windows, and with everyone's voices crying out at once, "Don't forget the dungeons! Hey, can you give us a hand with this door over here? Oh, here's another little winding stairs. Oh, I say, here's a poor kangaroo. Call Aslan. Phew, how it smells in here. Look out for trapdoors. Up here, there's a whole lot more up on the landing." But best of all was when Lucy came rushing upstairs shouting, "Aslan, Aslan, I found Mr. Tumnus. Oh, do come quick." And a moment later, Lucy and the little fawn were holding each other by both hands and dancing around and around for joy. The little chap was none the worse for having been made a statue, and was of course very interested in all she had to tell him. But at last the ransacking of the witch's fortress was ended. The whole castle stood empty, with every door and window open, and the light and the sweet spring air was flooding into all the dark and evil places which needed them so badly. The whole crowd of liberated statues surged back into the courtyard, and it was then that someone, Tumnus I think, first said, "But how are we going to get out?" For Aslan had got in by jumping over the wall, and the gates were still locked. "That'll be all right," said Aslan, and then rising up on his hind legs, he bawled up at the giant. "Hi there! You up there!" he roared. "What's your name?" Giant Rumblebuffin, if it please your honor," said the giant, once more touching his cap. "Well then, Giant Rumblebuffin," said Aslan, "just let us out of this, will you?" "Oh, certainly, your honor, it will be a pleasure," said Giant Rumblebuffin. "Stand well away from the gates, all you little uns." Then he strode to the huge gate himself, and bang, bang, bang went his huge club. The gates creaked at the first blow, cracked at the second, and shivered at the third. Then he tackled the towers on each side of the gates, and after a few minutes of crashing and thudding, both the towers and a good bit of the wall on each side went thundering down in a mass of hopeless rubble. And when the dust cleared, it was odd, standing in that dry, grim, plain, stony yard, to see through the gap all the grass and waving trees and sparkling streams of the forest and the blue hills beyond that, and beyond them, the blue, blue sky. "Well, blow it if I ain't all in a muck sweat," said the giant, puffing away like the largest railway engine. "Comes of being out of condition, I suppose. I don't imagine neither of you young ladies has such a thing as a pocket handkerchief about you." "Oh, yes, I have," said Lucy, standing up on her tiptoes and holding her handkerchief up just as far as she could reach. "Oh, thank you, missy," said Giant Rumblebuffin, stooping down. Next moment, Lucy got rather a fright, for she found herself caught up in midair between the giant's finger and thumb. But just as she was getting near his face, he suddenly started, then realized that what he'd done, and he gently put her back down on the ground, muttering, "Bless me, I've picked up the little girl instead. I beg your pardon, missy. I thought you was the handkerchief." "No, no," said Lucy, laughing. "Here it is." This time he managed to get the handkerchief, but it was only about the same size to him that maybe an aspirin would be to you and me on our fingers, so that when she saw him solemnly rubbing it to and fro across his red face, she said, "I'm afraid it's not much use to you, Mr. Rumblebuffin." "Oh, not at all, not at all," said the giant politely. "Never met a nicer handkerchief. So fine, so handy, so I don't know how to describe it." "What a nice giant he is," said Lucy to Mr. Tumnus. "Oh, yes," replied the fawn. "All the Buffins always were. One of the most respected of all the giant families in Narnia. Not very clever, perhaps. I never knew a giant that was, though. But they're an old family with traditions, you know. If he'd been the other sort, she'd have never turned him into stone." At this point, Aslan clapped his paws together and called for silence. "Our day's work is not yet over," he said, "and if the witch is to be finally defeated before bedtime, we must find the battle at once." "And join in, I hope, sir," added the largest of the centaurs. "Of course," said Aslan. "And now those who can't keep up, that is, children, dwarves, and the smallest animals, must ride on the backs of those who can, that is, lions, centaurs, unicorns, horses, giants, and eagles. Those who are good with their noses must come in the front with us lions to smell out where the battle is. Look lively and sort yourselves." And with a great deal of bustle and cheering, they did that. The most pleased of all of the lot was the other lion, who kept running around everywhere, pretending to be very busy, but really he did it in order to say to everyone he met, "Did you hear what he said? He said, 'us lions.' That means him and me, us lions. That's what I like about Aslan. No side, no standoffishness, just us lions. That meant him and me." At least he went on saying this until Aslan had loaded him up with 3 dwarves, 1 dryad, 2 rabbits, and a hedgehog. That steadied him a bit. Then when all were ready to go, it was a big sheepdog who actually helped Aslan get the most in getting them all sorted out and into their proper order. They all set out through the gap that the giant had made in the castle wall. At first the lions and dogs went nosing about in all directions, but then suddenly one great hound picked up the scent and gave a bay. "Ho, ho!" There was no time lost after that. Soon all the dogs and lions and wolves and other hunting animals were going at full speed, with their noses to the ground, and all the others streaked out for about half a mile behind them. They were following as fast as they could. The noise was like an English fox hunt, only better, because every now and then with the music of the hounds was mixed the roar of the other lion, and sometimes even the far deeper and more awful roar of Aslan himself. Faster and faster they went as the scent became easier and easier to follow. And then, just as they came round the last curve in a narrow, winding valley, Lucy heard above all these noises another noise, a different noise, which gave her a queer feeling inside. It was the noise of shouts and shrieks and the clashing of metal against metal. Then they came out of the narrow valley, and at once she saw the reason. There stood Peter and Edmund and all the rest of Aslan's army, fighting desperately against the crowd of horrible creatures whom she had seen last night. Only now, in the daylight, they looked even stranger and more evil and more deformed. There also seemed to be far more of them. Peter's army, which had their backs to her, looked terribly few, and there were statues dotted all over the battlefield, so apparently the witch had been using her wand, but she did not seem to be using it now. She was fighting with her stone knife. It was Peter she was fighting, both of them going at it so hard that Lucy could hardly make out what was happening. She only saw the stone knife and Peter's sword flashing so quickly that they looked like 3 knives and 3 swords. That pair were in the center. On each side of them the line stretched out. Horrible things were happening wherever she looked. "Off my back, children!" shouted Aslan, and they both tumbled off. Then, with a roar that shook all of Narnia from the western lamppost to the shores of the eastern sea, the great beast flung himself upon the White Witch. Lucy saw her face lifted towards him for 1 second with an expression of terror and amazement. Then lion and witch had rolled over together, but with the witch underneath, and at the same moment all warlike creatures whom Aslan had led from the witch's house rushed madly onto the enemy lines, dwarves with their battle axes, dogs with their teeth, the giant with his club and his feet also crushed dozens of the enemy, unicorns with their horns, centaurs with swords and hooves, and Peter's tired army cheered, and the newcomers roared, and the enemy squealed and gibbered till the wood re-echoed with the din of that onset. And that's how Aslan led the fight against the witch. It's the end of chapter 16. We have 1 chapter to go, chapter 17, the hunting of the white stag. Are you going to be back for that one? Of course you are. And we'll be done this book, and we'll have to go into the next book.